Hi guys, in this video we are going to take a look at the more delicate types of specialty fabrics and then the best types of techniques for finishing the seams or working with a lining or an underlay. A lining can be used to enclose all the seams, which is great because a lot of these specialty really delicate fabrics will fray pretty easily and are harder to do a clean zigzag type finish because they're so delicate. Now, when you're working with an underlay, it's a different type of fabric and you use this to kind of support the fabric itself. So you would sew pieces together with a backing and you use that sewn together before you assemble your garment, and it helps with the body and the structure of the pieces. So this is important and is sometimes used depending on the design. So you might have a pattern that the original design is just a standard fabric, even a quilting cotton. And if you want to substitute a more specialty type of fabric, you're just going to need to consider those types of things. Like, is it see-through? If you're using chiffon, you're definitely going to want to back that with another fabric so that you don't see right through it. So we'll take a look at the types of fabrics used for this technique and when you're going to need to do it. Many of you may be familiar with Melinda of Melody Valerie Couture. We had her on the Liberty Jane design team for a few years, and she is amazing in this category. She loves to go deep into the techniques of couture sewing and the use of different types of fabrics, and then the combination of underlays, linings, and seam finishes with all these different types of fabrics. So I'm going to tag team it with her a little bit throughout the course of this video as we take a closer look at all of these types of techniques. All right, let's jump in and take a closer look. In front of us right here, we have a variety of fabrics that we can use as a lining or even an underlay. Over here on the far right, we have a very beautiful rayon challis, and this is so soft. It's got a really nice drape. It's a beautiful fabric for using as a lining under a sheer silk chiffon or something like that you want to maintain that flow and the drape within that fabric. Another great thing about this fabric is that it's a natural fiber, so it dyes really well. This was actually a white fabric and we dyed this along with some cotton laces to create a whole selection of fabrics that all coordinated well together. Now this blue fabric is a cotton lawn, and you can see as I put my hand underneath here, it's fairly sheer, but it doesn't have quite the same drape as this first one. This one has a lot of movement to it. This one is a little bit stiffer. So this is nice. It's very lightweight if you want to add a little bit of structure to a fabric that's sheer, but maybe it doesn't hold its shape well enough for the garment that you're working on. So this one's great. It's cotton, it's all natural, and it is a beautiful fabric to use as both a lining or an underlay. And as we move towards the center, we have some more standard lining fabrics. This silver colored one is actually a Bemberg rayon lining. So this is a little bit more expensive. It's very soft and supple. It's a beautiful fabric. And then these ones over to the left are nylon standard linings. They're a little bit crisper and a little bit sturdier. So depending on the look of your garment and the structure that you're trying to achieve, you can look at these different types of linings. I will say that for doll clothes, I do find that these ones over on the left are easier to work with. This Bemberg lining is very shifty, it's very slippery, and unless you're really trying to achieve that soft and supple feel for the whole garment, it's a hard one to use because it's hard to keep cut straight and lined up with your pieces. And these linings over on the left that are a nylon or polyester blend are actually inexpensive, very cute if you can find delicate little prints, and are very easy to sew with and work well in a variety of garments. The only thing with these is that you have to be careful when pressing because this is not a natural fiber. So some of these, if you're pressing these too hot, you can easily melt these fabrics. So you do need to pay special attention to that type of detail when using any of these fabrics. Another fabric that I've used a few times as an underlay to help aid me in some hemming is a standard tulle. So this is just a gray standard tulle. And here is an example of a project that I'm working on. I have a silk do peony cut out for my dress sleeve, and part of this dress is lined, but the sleeves, to reduce bulk, are not lined. So it created a little bit of a challenge when I was thinking through the best way to hem the bottom edge of the sleeve without having any of the stitch lines showing on the exterior part of the fabric. Now I could carefully just roll this hem and hand stitch this as careful as possible just to kind of prick into the fabric, but it would still probably leave markings on the outside because this fabric is so delicate. So you can see here, and I'll just pull this apart so you can see, I have backed this fabric with this tool, and I've just sewn around the outside perimeter just to hold that nice and flat before the dress is constructed. So with this technique, I haven't added any weight to this piece of fabric. It's added a little bit of structure to it, which is fine for this design. So then when I am at my final stages and I'm going to gently roll this hem up, and I can press under my one edge, I roll it again, and then I will just very carefully hand sew my hem down, pricking just along this tulle fabric. So it will catch that hem on the inside, stitched along the tulle, but then on the outside I will have no visible marking of that stitching or hem at all.
Nearly any fabric can be used as a backing. Usually couturiers go for the natural fibers like linen, cotton, and silk. The important thing is to match the backing fabric to your shell or fashion fabric. Now you want a backing fabric that's lighter than your outer fabric, but it can be crisper or softer depending on the look that you're after. Now before I jump into demos, I just wanted to add a quick note about interfacing. In couture, the line between interfacing and backing is kind of blurred. Couture doesn't usually use fusible interfacings because they don't move as well, they don't hang as freely. They're also usually made of artificial fibers, and couture does tend to prefer natural fibers versus artificial. As a result, interfacings, when used, are usually sew-in, and then this begins to look a bit like a backing, and so just think about the needs that your garment is going to have. Play around with putting different fabrics behind. See whether an interfacing weight fabric is going to do what you need, or whether a full backing is going to do what you need. Sometimes just a partial backing or a partial interfacing will be enough. I just wanted to show you really quickly how to actually back your fabrics. So this is a bodice piece from the Melody Valerie Statement and Taffeta dress. This fabric has got some thickness to it, but it's very soft, very drapeable. So I wanted to give it a little bit of strength, and that's why I'm using just plain cotton muslin underneath. I've cut out the two pieces identically, and then I'm just going to go ahead and pin them together along the outside edges. Now that my bodice piece is pinned to the backing piece, I'm going to take my piece of silk thread here, and I'm going to make a couple of back stitches at the beginning, just outside the stitch line. And in this case, I'm just eyeballing the stitch line because this pattern is designed with 1/4 inch seam allowances, and so you just measure in from the seam allowances to find the stitch line. But if you thread marked your stitch line, you can definitely use that as a guide mark as well. Okay, so there's one back stitch. That's usually just enough to anchor a basting thread like this. Then you just work your way slowly around the outside of the piece, trying not to pull it up as you go. You can remove pins when you come to them. Just baste straight off to the end of the piece, then clip off your thread and start again rather than turning the corner. This is going to keep the corner from pulling in accidentally. Here's the completed basting. You can see the backing fabric has been attached the entire way around, and at this point the piece is ready for construction. This little bodice is a prototype from the Melody Valerie Transcontinental dress, and it uses a sort of modified backing technique. This outer fabric that I wanted to use is this really lightweight wool jersey. It curls up really easily when you press it though, so I wanted to give it some support. Also, it doesn't block light very well, so it needed an extra layer behind it. However, I really liked the way that the pleats looked with just the wool jersey. So instead of backing the entire fabric before pleating it, I pleated the wool jersey and then backed it with a second piece of fabric. This one's got a little bit of stretch in it so that it mimics the tiny bit of stretch in the wool jersey. And it really bulks out the bodice just enough. It gives it that strength that it needs and blocks the light without it being too much extra fabric. This skirt is a slightly different example of a stay. It's just the basic Liberty Jane bubble skirt, but here the lining is acting as a stay. It's slightly shorter than the fashion fabric, and that's part of what holds this outer layer of fashion fabric in this beautiful bubble shape and keeps you from seeing the seam line. The lining is just shorter and it's holding this outer fabric in place.
Now, no matter the fabric that you're working with or the linings or underlays that you've chosen, you are going to have to think through the type of seam finish for the interior of the garment. So there are a few varieties, and I'm going to have Melinda walk you through those as we take a closer look at French seams, flat-felled seams, and use of a Hong Kong binding. But first, here's a quick look at an example of a Hong Kong binding in use. So here we have the inside view of the Hello Oscar dress, and this is that bottom flounced portion that gives it that mermaid look. So we have these seams pressed open, and we've used a Hong Kong binding along the edge of each side to finish that elegantly. So the inside looks just as nice as the outside. And then here is a different look. This is a rayon challis, and it's like a chambray look, but it's very soft, delicate, flowy type of fabric. And on this one, you can see that we have pressed these seams open and simply just zigzagged them on that outside raw edge, which is still a little rough looking, but it does provide a finished look. Now you could also do this with a serged edge, which might look a little bit better. But as I look at this now, and it has a very cute lining on the inside of the bodice, the outside is very cute, and with the eyelet detail on this upper back, it all has a lot of really cute detail, and I feel like this probably takes it down a notch once you open it up and look at the inside. So if I was, for example, to take this blue colored cotton lawn fabric, which coordinates with the blue that's in this lining, cut some nice bias strips, and then come down and do Hong Kong binding on this exterior edge of these pressed open seams. And then once my lining is tacked down and the bottom of the dress is hemmed, it will provide a very cute and kind of that wow pop on the inside that really elevates it to the standard of a Liberty Jane design. So this is just something to think through as you're constructing your garment, to really just keep in mind the interior finish as well as the exterior finish. It all matters, and it all comes together to create something that's really unique and beautiful.
In my years sewing doll couture, I've had lots of opportunities to experiment with different edge finishes, and I just want to take a minute and tell you about some of my favorite methods for doll couture. First off, the French seam. This is probably something you're already aware of, but it's this beautiful double row of stitching that enfolds the seam allowances in the fabric itself. It makes for just a really gorgeous, classy finished edge. You can work it in a bunch of different widths, slightly wider for side seams and center backs or whatever, very narrow for sheer fabrics, and it's just a really lovely touch. When sewing a French seam, the first step is actually to determine how much seam allowance you need before cutting out your pieces. In most cases for doll couture, you want to figure out how wide you'd like your finished seam to be and then add 1/4 inches to that. In this sample, because I'm having a 1/4 inch finished width and then I left an extra 1/4 inch of seam allowance, I'm going to mark my stitch line, my finished stitch line, at 1/2 inch. I'm also going to mark my first stitch line at 1/4 inch. Pin your 2 fabric pieces together with the right sides out and the wrong sides together so that it's the opposite of how you normally would stitch a seam. Then stitch along your first marked stitch line. Press the seam flat to set your stitching, and then trim away the seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. That's usually about as small as you can go without the seam pulling out. Open out your seam, press it flat, and then press it around itself so that the wrong sides of the fabric wrap around the seam allowances. Then run a second line of stitching at your desired finished width away from this first stitched edge. Press to set this second line of stitching, and then open out your seam and double check that you did catch all of the little raw edges successfully. If you have any small raw bits of fabric sticking out, you can just trim those fuzzies off. Another great edge finish is the flat felled seam. This is where you actually take the finished seam allowances, fold them under, and then fell or top stitch the folded edge down to the inside of the garment. The Melody Valerie Yacht Club dress is finished almost exclusively with flat felled seams. I really like the sort of sporty detail that this gives. Flat felled seams are also a traditional finish in menswear, so using flat felled seams is a good way to sort of evoke a tailored look or a tailored feel in your garments. The flat felled seam is another seam which it's important to cut a little bit of extra seam allowance on your pieces. Usually I like to leave a 3/8 inch seam allowance for flat felled seams. I find this is usually just about right. If you'd like to fell both sides of your seam, then just open up your seam and press the seam allowances flat. Then press under 1/8 of an inch along both edges of the seam allowance. And then you can either hand slip stitch or hand fell them to the fashion fabric or machine top stitch them down. You can also fell both seam allowances to one side. To do that, trim one seam allowance down to about 1/8 or 3/16 of an inch wide. Press under 1/8 of an inch along the raw edge of the other seam allowance, and then press the seam so that the folded seam allowance laps over the trimmed down one. Stitch close to the folded edge to complete the seam. I know I've mentioned the Hong Kong binding before, but it is really one of my favorite edge finishes for the inside of a garment. It adds that extra bit of luxury, that extra detail that people really don't expect, and I think really adds a lot to the garment. To add a Hong Kong binding, cut a strip of bias that is longer than the edge that you need to finish. If you're finishing a curved edge, press a curve into the bias strip before pinning it down. Line up the raw edges and then stitch them together. When cutting your bias strip, make sure that it is wide enough to have seam allowance, cover the seam allowance, and then lap around the back with a little bit of extra room. If you want, for example, an 1/8 inch wide binding, you'll probably want a 1/2 inch wide strip. For this example, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch wide finish binding, so I've cut my strip 1 inch wide. That allows for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, a 1/4 inch turnover, a 1/4 inch around the back, and then some extra so that I can actually catch it when I go to stitch in the ditch. Trim off any excess bias at the top and bottom of the seam. Then press the seam flat to set the stitching, and press the bias binding away from the body of the garment. Press the binding around to the back side, making sure that the edge of the binding covers your previous stitch line. If your binding isn't quite long enough, you may need to go back in and trim out just a tiny bit of your seam allowance. This is why I usually prefer to bind seam allowances after I've sewn the seam, because I find that it's a lot more accurate to stitch the seam first and then bind it. Just for reasons like this, you know, if I have to take out a little extra seam allowance to make the binding fit. Or even if I don't have to clip down any of the seam allowance, the binding itself changes the width of the seam allowance just ever so slightly, and so it's more precise to bind after sewing your seam. Pin the binding down to the wrong side and then stitch in the ditch just next to this folded edge of the binding to secure. Finish your Hong Kong binding by giving it a good press and trimming off any loose threads.
I hope the techniques and instruction shown in this video will really become a good resource for you and just kind of help you think through the process of your fabric choices and what you're going to need to do to make fabrics work for the project that you have in mind. So I challenge you to take something that you're familiar with, that you've sewn before and you've used a standard quilting cotton, and maybe mix it up a little bit. You can take a pretty regular looking dress and turn it into a wow type of princess dress just with your choice of fabrics. So I'd love to see anything that you've done or that you work on with this method. So just be sure to share it with us on the Pixie Fair Facebook page or in the Sewing with Cinnamon group. We'd love to see it, and I'm sure it will really motivate and challenge other people to do the same thing.